So, we said the other day, yesterday perhaps, that when you go to add, over time, as you add new features to software, adding that feature can either take more time than you think it ought to. It could take the amount of time you think it ought to, or it could take less time than you think it ought to. And we've drawn this here as velocity going upward, and we think we think that is the natural state of things.
Now it seems like people say, well, why should velocity go up? Because it never ever has. But the reason velocity ought to go up is that software development is about knowledge creation. And therefore, the further we get into a software project, the smarter we ought to be. And therefore, you would think things would go faster.
Now, on a typical project, starting about after lunch on the first day, you begin adding new features to code you've already written. And so when you add a new feature, you actually are taking the code that is currently available and adding new code to it to generate a new feature. So every new feature is in fact composed of a little bit of stuff that already exists and then some stuff that you just added. And so you have this sort of, we've destroyed the schedule this afternoon. So every feature is composed of a little bit of the old and a little bit of the new. And we think this is the key to why things should perhaps get easier as you go along.
Now, it's just obvious that you really ought to go faster because this available code base is just increasing all the time. So therefore, you would think that you would be able to go faster. But in fact, you want to go that way? I'm coming back over here.
Oh, sorry. I was just making.
In fact, we don't. Why not?
So why don't we? And that is because as we construct new pieces of code, sometimes it is not as clean as it ought to be. So we're doing what we like to call a rat's nest, and Ron drew the universal symbol for rat's nest, which you've seen already. Or you have the option of actually drawing something that is well factored, well designed, implemented properly, and it looks like this with nice little squares of functionality in code using a nice diagram there. And
it's a HIPAA diagram or a hypo diagram, whatever one of those things are. So it seems like you ought to be able to go faster if you would do things well, and that is essentially amounts to the construction of things that you can use.
And so that's what it means, that within any given piece of code, there is actually two types of value embodied in it. First is sort of the transactional value, which just means this software exhibits some degree of functionality. This is what the customer sees. This is why they want you to build the software, right? This is what you're paying for. But also within that software is sort of what we in economics would call a capital value. It is the value that can be used within that software to construct something else.
So instead of talking about this stuff as being technical debt, which is a good metaphor and we love it, we think that it is not representing the fact that what you really ought to be doing if you're going to accelerate is building up these things here, which we want to call
liquid assets. So giving it a positive spin, because the idea is I can have a lot of capital assets or a few capital assets, and we want those capital assets to increase over time, which always moves us in a good situation. Whereas, as we've kind of pointed out, when I have actually depleted all the technical debt, I am just back at zero where I should have been anyway. And we want to think about increasing something that is good as opposed to decreasing something that is bad.
So both of those words are important. They're assets, which is a much more positive thing to have in the mind of one of these numbers guys than debt. And they are liquid, which is what enables us to reuse them as we build more and more software on top of what's going on.
I have no idea what that card means anymore.
Well, that card really means
that
if you talk about technical debt, you're basically talking about mistakes that have been made. Our story is technical debt is bad, not good. And some people think debt is good, which has been brought up. But we're talking about mistakes that have been made, and they have mostly been made by us programmers. under, unfortunately, often very great pressure, so that they shouldn't have been made at all.
Under the bullwhip of oppressive
Management, right?
management.
You know, the
but,
thumb of
But I think we have to look inside about why we let ourselves to have been captured.
The thumb of the man. Whereas if we look at this thing as the necessity of a project to create liquid assets, this will transform the discussion into one where there is business value to what we're doing, not a let's dig our way out of debt, which is always kind of a draggy situation to be in, as I well know. But instead, it's an opportunity kind of a thing. So we think that from the viewpoint of the market, as Brian was talking about it, that is perhaps a more useful metaphor. And we're not saying use it all the time, but we're saying that would be an interesting aspect. There is this other side that Brian talked about, which is, oops, that's not an S. I can't talk and write at the same time, which is the social side. Is that the right word for that?
Right. So the rewards within a team of doing good work, the rewards within a social structure set up between developers and product owners and whoever else they're engaging with, that reinforces our desire to please each other and therefore be able to enable us to do good work.
And this also goes to what Matt has been saying throughout the session about the craft that one follows. So here is the sort of the selling side if we need to do any selling, but we also have a tiny thought on what you really want to do from the craft viewpoint.
So once you want to, I can keep talking or I can keep going. Mike raised his hand.
Keep talking.
So now that you perhaps think, I think we spent the last day and a half thinking that technical debt or whatever we're calling it is a bad thing. What do you actually do about it? What are the guidelines that when you're sitting down with your hands on the keyboard, what do you do? Now, quite a while ago, Kent Beck came up with 4 rules for simplicity within code. And we believe that is the starting place, at least the last 3 of those. Now, the Beckian rules of simplicity. The first one is that for code to be simple, it must run all the tests. I do not believe this has anything to do with technical debt, because if it doesn't run the tests, that's a functional thing, not an internal bit of the code. But that is sort of the beginning with everything we do. So once you get past runs all the tests, does what the code provides all the value externally that it's supposed to. Internally, what? You like that? He wants to go to lunch.
All right.
So secondly is the code should have no duplication. And duplication takes many forms. There is the obvious bit of this chunk of code looks like that chunk of code. And we've all seen that, and we can all think of ways of getting rid of that. There's also duplication within software where things occur more than once when there's actually no need to. And we've probably all seen bits of code where at this point in time, I'm really not sure whether the database has been read or not, so I'm going to read it again. And you find database reads occurring in various places, or whatever those things are, occurring in multiple places.
And that is, I think, the fundamental flaw that we find in rat's nest code, which is some conceptual idea is being done all over the system instead of in one place in the system.
Third is it expresses all the ideas relevant to this problem. It expresses all the ideas the developer had in his head when he was writing the code. Expresses all the ideas that relate to how the business intends this code to be used. This is really the main form of asset. This is what causes you to get objects that understand something about your business, as opposed to having, just having an array list holding a collection of things. This is what causes you to have an object that knows it's dealing with a collection of songs from my iTunes, as opposed to just having a clear collection of those.
So a technical asset.
How does that differ from 1?
1 is runs all the tests. That's purely it. No, 3 is
expresses the ideas.
The ideas.
An element of the software is a valuable asset only if it is broken out so that you can see that capability. These 2 systems may have the same capabilities. This one here is all wiggled through it. We can't really reuse it. We express that idea by creating a class, an object, or a method. Now we have something that we can use as an asset.
If I'm creating a payroll system, is there a check object inside of it, or is there just a collection of line items? And fourth, minimizes all architectural artifacts. Fewest number of lines of code, fewest methods, fewest classes, fewest interfaces.
So that comes back to Michael's.
Certainly these last three things work against each other. That my desire to reduce the number of lines of code causes me to want to be less expressive. The desire to be expressive causes me to increase the number of lines of code. And so these things are in order of importance. You want to reduce duplication even if it makes things a little bit less easy to understand. And you want to add code to increase understanding and expression within the code, even if it increases the number of classes, the number of lines, the number of methods.
So what we see there is the balance. Michael talked about whether is a code base, should it be large or small? Is it better to be bigger or smaller? It is better to be bigger insofar as we are creating assets. It is better to be smaller in every other way.
If we're creating craft with those lots. Yes, Mike?
Okay, one thing I just wanted to kind of ask is, in the beginning you basically said, well, basically the speed at which we can add features and over time should increase. But the thing is, I think it does increase, but always relative to the cost of building things from scratch. And I think that perspective, right?
Well, I certainly have examples within my life of once you get to a system that has these sort of attributes in them, that coming along with some new feature can be incredibly fast to build.
Yes,
by simply taking components that understand the domain and plugging them together in a new way, and maybe writing little code to glue them together, and bingo, you can do this thing that nobody even thought about when you first started writing the code.
Right, so
Now,
there's two different ways of looking at this in terms of value.
Yes, and there's always that question of is it? It may be more expensive than we would wish, but it might still be cheaper than writing the whole system all again.
And this is really,
I think no one has begun to touch the limits of how far you can really grow a system in terms of faster and faster implementation through keeping the code really clean. Ward Cunningham talks about their work at whatever that company's name was, Valuetron or whatever the name was, where they went forever and forever and ever, and they just got better and better and better. Well, okay, any company with Ward Cunningham in it has that property. But I believe it also tells you that it is possible to do it, which to me brings it back to the craft question. How good are you? How good do you want to be? Let us not imagine for a minute that what we see in our crafty code that we wrote and the crafty code that other people wrote is the limit of what is possible. What is possible is far, far beyond anything most of us are able to do on any given day.
Rob and then Matt.
Number 4 I find really interesting. Matt has made several mentions of, we need to change the system to encourage the good behavior and discourage the bad behavior. Historically, number of lines of code has been used as a bragging point by software developers. And even this year, I had heard some company that actually would just track the number of lines of code their people would write and gauge their productivity based on, oh, this guy writes a lot more lines of code than that guy. And Agile's kind of getting some of this figured out, and 1 through 4 I think are all consistent with Agile. So I think we're making progress in turning things around, but I'm just entertained by number 4 being the polar opposite of the former bragging point.
Back around the turn of the century, the way you showed that you were prosperous was by being incredibly fat.
Right.
And I think that's what...
the turn of the previous century.
The previous century.
I would think.
No longer is it thought that this figure that I have represents prosperity. It represents laziness and other things. And I think we're seeing the same thing in code. That it used to be, yeah, sure, I wrote 1 trillion lines of code. What did they do? Nothing. I think we're beginning to see that turn around.
Yeah, and to add to what you said, I thought of an example. Tell me if you disagree, right? But if I were hired at Google today and I had a problem to solve that was along the lines of some kind of distributed search, maybe it's a mashup with Google Maps, whatever, using information gleaned from the internet, and I wanted to build an app that did something with that, they do it all the time, and I go there, the tools they give me would make me ridiculously fast compared to if I had to write it from scratch. And I suspect that if I was hired today versus if I was hired by them in 2001, I would be faster still now than I would be then. Now they have a lot of people working in their infrastructure groups and building those tools, but there's one example of you can say we can use the asset portion of our code to spur velocity on, and you can measure it and make it tangible, and you can see how much faster you'd be. And then if you went move to San Francisco and Paul Graham Fund, you'd be your own startup.
Yeah. Now, we can talk about it, not at this time, but it's possible to talk about strategies of development ranging from very expedient, where we just crack out features without regard to any decent structure, to let's build some infrastructure for a couple of years and then have some software, to what we would think is appropriate, which is in the middle. Let's build the features at a pace which is exactly right for going forward, at least even, and possibly accelerating forever.
Our break in 4 minutes. Chris, Patrick, Chris. I'm first.
Yep.
Okay.
Chris
Claim you are and you will be.
So one of the things I found when doing this is I can't talk about this with most development organizations. And the reason is, and at least I believe, is I found this out before I knew about the 4 principles of simplicity. I found it out because I just didn't know any better, and I started doing some weird stuff. And people were like, what are you doing with that? Why are you removing stuff? Why are you moving things around all the time? And why you're coding? Well, I didn't know any better. And then I found out it worked really well, so then I started doing them. Now all of a sudden I see this, and it's like, wow. Of course.
Yeah.
How do you talk about this with somebody who doesn't know anything about that yet?
There is no hope ever, in my opinion, after years of trying to do this, talking to somebody who isn't ready to listen. So you really got to wait until they're ready to listen. Then I think what you do is to sit down and show them.
That's the thing.
A little bit of this might get somebody fired up, but probably at least half the people in this room are thinking, yeah, but not in my code base. And what would change your mind would be to have someone clever, maybe Michael, I couldn't possibly do it, sit down with you and make your code base a little better right in front of your eyes. You've got to be ready, and then you got to show them.
I think doing a little bit of it and even showing them a little bit of it without necessarily talking about it might spur their interest in the same sort of way that people working around Rob might have noticed that all of a sudden he is now going faster than any of the rest of them. I wonder what he did that caused that to happen. And were any of them bright enough to come by and say, what did you do? Don't know.
I'm struck that owners like to have concrete, quantifiable numbers to describe their assets. And so lines of code, imperfect as it was, is a concrete number that people can say, I have an asset of 1 million lines of code. They want to think about it that way. And I'm wondering, the number that sounds like a more interesting asset to me, or way to describe these assets, part of it is velocity itself. What other, is it a small score?
I would not really recommend going down that path very far, but the other thing that might be suggested out of this is there would be some way of counting reusable assets in the software. However, it's really important never to confuse a metaphor with reality and to try to make your metaphor work in reality. So I'd be really cautious about using this for anything more than to inspire and to have them go, oh, now I see what you're talking about. And then let's go back and write the damn code correctly instead of in this sucky other way.
Yeah, I would not try to get this on the balance sheet. We would need an income statement.
I apologize to the others on the stack. Chris, take the phone. Have a good one.
So, as the man said, rust never sleeps. And do you think that, again, changing my position again because I'm allowed, the business domain changes and suddenly your lovely little box becomes completely irrelevant? Is that truly technical debt, or do you still think we have a liquid asset in place?
We take the narrow Ward Cunningham view of technical debt, which it is the lack of internal changes one should have made to the software one had in order to make it good software. These other things we talked about, people running Win 2000 on Atari clusters and stuff like that, are interesting and difficult problems, but that is definitely not what we're talking about.
I believe that if the world changes and instead of your company producing payroll systems, you're going to produce an air traffic control system. It would be much easier to take this payroll system and turn it into an air traffic control system than that one. And if I was in that situation,
Think about that for a minute.
I believe if they started giving me stories about air traffic control, I would continue working on this code base, and eventually I would have an air traffic control system, and I have a chance. I believe that I would get there faster than if I started with a blank sheet of paper. But I am well known to be crazy.
Anybody
Thank you,
comments, libraries?
Thank you.
See, we told you we could do it.